So I think you're right. That's a big thing that sends us off in the wrong direction as marketers.
Welcome to That's What I Call Marketing, the podcast where you'll hear from the leading lights in the marketing world and listen to their unique insights. If you are enjoying episodes of That's What I Call Marketing, and of course I hope you are, I would love if you could help us out a little bit, and it'll take you just a couple of seconds if you can rate or review the show, subscribe to episodes, and even share episodes with people you think might enjoy the episodes. It would really help us continue to reach an even bigger audience, and we have tens of thousands of people that tune into That's What I Call Marketing, and it is great and really appreciate all of you joining us every single week. On to this week's episode, and I had seen this guy speak, gosh, it must be 8 or 10 years ago now, when Colin Lewis invited him over to Dublin for a talk, and I went along and watched him speak, and I was absolutely fascinated by what he talked about. And I met him again just a couple of months ago at the TAM Ireland lunch, and luckily enough I got to sit beside him, and of course I asked him to be a guest on That's What I Call Marketing. He's become one of the most influential voices in marketing, and it is, of course, Richard Shotton. His behavioural science expertise is second to none, and he's the author of 2 brilliant books, The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice. His work explores the hidden psychological forces that shape how we buy, choose, and behave, often ways we don't even realise. He's worked with big brands like Google, Barclays, and Brewdog. That's a great one to work with, helping them apply evidence-based marketing in the real world. Now, this isn't just theory, it is about practical, proven ways to make your marketing even more effective. We go on beyond, hopefully beyond usual sound bites in this chat. You're going to get into deep knowledge about how you can apply this to your marketing every single day. We're going to talk about B2B, B2C, FMCG, hopefully a bit about insurance as well. So if you are in any of those spaces or just a curious marketer, I think you're going to take something really valuable from this brilliant episode with the encyclopedic mind of Richard Shotton.
If you would like to reach an engaged community of marketing leaders, get in touch with That's What I Call Marketing to discuss sponsorship opportunities.
Richard, thanks a million for joining me on That's What I Call Marketing. Great to have you here.
It's fantastic to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Appreciate it. And I was saying my intro, I got to see you. I think I probably got the years wrong, but you spoke in Dublin. You just written your first book. Colin Lewis brought you over to Dublin.
Oh gosh, yeah, long time ago.
Yeah, it is a long time ago. And I get, again, the book was only out, I think, and I was just like, oh my god, like this stuff I had no idea about. And I was like, this is fascinating. And then obviously I got to sit beside you at the TAM Ireland lunch and get re-fascinated by it all again. It's kind of a fascinating journey or kind of space that you've ended up in, and you've talked about it as well, but like those things around like blood donation brief that kind of led you into maybe this whole area in a more, I don't know, pronounced way, I guess. Can you tell me a bit about that? It was a brief that came in and then you kind of found a solution, that helped kind of drive right. more.
I started work, 2000, media planner, and I was always slightly frustrated with media because it felt like we would, learn something, let's say Google create a new algorithm or Meta offer a new product, you would learn all about it, why it's beneficial or not for clients, and then 3 months later it had disappeared and you had to start again. So I always felt we were on this kind of hamster wheel. So there was that kind of nagging frustration at the back of our mind. And then we got a brief from the NHS. So it was around how to encourage people to give blood, and it was an annual plan for the client. And just coincidentally, when the brief came in, I was reading The Tipping Point. So you might remember that Malcolm Gladwell book. So this dates it, it's about 2004. And just so happened that the section I was on was about the bystander effect. So there is a series of studies from 2 1960s Americans called Latane and Darley, which show if you ask lots of people for help, there is a diffusion of responsibility and every individual becomes a little bit less likely to help because everyone says, why should I bother going through the pain of, say, blood donating when everyone else has been asked, they can do it. So I remember reading that and thinking, gosh, this is exactly the problem that the blood service have. We're going out and saying blood stocks are low in England, please donate. And just as Latane and Darley is suggesting, most people are thinking, well, I don't want to go through the pain and then the hassle of doing it. I'll leave it to someone else. Yeah. So read that experiment, went and spoke to the creative agency and said, look, why don't we do a test of, trying to make a more personal sense of responsibility. So it was a very crude suggestion. It was like, rather than go out and say blood stocks are low in England, please donate, why don't we go out and say blood stocks are low in Birmingham or Basildon or Burnley?
Yeah.
A tiny, crude change to the message. But even that had a 10-15% improvement to response levels. So when I saw that you could take one of these studies from the 1960s that had been done by psychologists, you could take the broad finding, apply it to a live brief 50 years later, I was absolutely hooked, because I thought, well, rather than us flailing around thinking about how we should solve briefs, why don't we draw on the work of brilliant psychologists who have tested the best way of influence in those settings? So that was back in 2004. And basically since then, I just tried to change my job until I was eventually specializing in behavioral science and eventually setting up my own consulting.
And it's amazing how that kind of those moments happen, like the right thing, the right brief came at the right moment where you're reading the right book in some sense. Yeah.
Do you know what? I think that is interesting, that if you look back on your career, or there's so much chance. I think afterwards when people explain things, they often pretend there was a plan and everything was very logical. Yeah. But and actually at the time, it was all haphazard and chaotic, and knows which way it might have went. But I think there's an awful lot of randomness involved.
Oh, my career is completely random. There is and was no plan. And that's an interesting point you make about kind of like the media changing so fast, right? So, and it's faster now, right? Everything is just at such pace. Algorithms change. And we've seen it, where Google make these kind of core updates and everything changes. Your generic or SEO traffic falls off a cliff. I'm reading so much, and then they've got like the AI agents and all that kind of coming in. But like, I guess the human behavior, lots of human behavior is quite stable to a degree.
I think you're right to distinguish between the two. I mean, firstly, I think it's undeniable there is a lot of change in technology and society. I think that's true. However, I'm always slightly skeptical for saying that we are in a unique situation. I mean, you go back to the mid-19th century and you've got people like Marx saying all that's solid melts into the air. People have for a long time been talking about how their age is uniquely in churn. And I think if you're a Victorian, imagine the changes that you saw, the telegraph, the first flight. I mean, these are radio. These are kind of like shockingly large changes. So I'm slightly skeptical about saying that we're uniquely in flux, but that maybe put that to one side. Even though if technology changes, that the fundamental influences on people, that is remarkably consistent. So one of the greatest creative directors of the 20th century was Bill Bernbach, so founder of DDB, his agency responsible for great ads like Avis and the classic VW work.
Oh, I love that Avis work.
Yeah, brilliant. Maybe talk about that later, because there's definitely a behavioural bias there. But he famously said, it's taken millions of years for man's nature to develop. It'll take millions of years for it to change. It may be fashionable to talk about the changing man, but we as communicators, we should be concerned with the unchanging man. And I think it's interesting, that comment, and it's behavioural science is very much about what are those fundamental drivers that affect the unchanging person. The influence of other people, the prioritisation of ease over effort, the desire for things that are in short supply. You can look back through history and see these biases being just as applicable.
There's so much there that one of the things I want to touch on, we have to talk about Avis, but before that is, and I don't know what your views are on this, but in terms of the generational thing, so, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, all that kind of stuff. And I remember working in agencies maybe 20 years ago and, hearing how whatever the generation was back then were different. They wanted authenticity. They wanted to be in control. They want, like all these things. And then a year ago, I was hearing the same thing about whatever generation is now.
And the poles of this argument, I think the extremes are, equally flawed. Like, it'd be very hard to say an 18-year-old today is exactly the same as an 18-year-old in I was 18, I think, 1993, 1994. Think of the change in things like homophobia, racism, there are phenomenal changes.
Yeah.
And I think trying to deny that is absurd. But to claim that this generation is completely different, they're independent thinkers, I keep on hearing, they're authentic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's equally bogus.
Yeah.
I touched very briefly on this idea of social proof. So of all the behavioural science studies, it's probably one that there's the most evidence. So it's essentially the argument that humans are a social animal and we are deeply influenced by what others do. So we don't make decisions as a discrete individual generally, but we look around to what others are doing. And if something looks like it's popular, it becomes more popular still. Now, that is a very long-standing finding. But one of the most common questions I get is, well, okay, this might have worked with millennials or Gen X or boomers, but it's different now. But interestingly, if you look at the studies, the larger scale studies that are on a big enough sample size that you can split by generation, if anything, it's younger people who are more affected. Now, I'm not necessarily arguing that's a generational thing, more a youth thing, because the argument would be a bias like social proof is most powerful in a situation of uncertainty. So if we know we don't know, then we're more likely to copy the crowd. And I would say generally as a rule of thumb, the younger you are, the less experience you have, the more you're going to realise that you don't know, and therefore the more likely you are to be influenced by your peers.
Yeah, and look, it's funny, I had a conversation with my dad recently about, I have a 12-year-old and, him and his friends go out and they all wear, like the Monterex, Monterain, North Face, and they all look exactly the same. The hair's the same. They all wear black. And I'm just like, and I said to my dad, I said, oh my God, would you look at the state of them? Like that, we were never like that. And he just looked at me and was like, yes, you were. It just wasn't.
Yeah, I certainly would never be in a position to laugh at a teenager's fashion choices. I was slightly strange as a child. I was massively into 1960s music and the whole kind of hippie vibe. I used to wear a pair of, at 16, a pair of flares that my aunt had made out of a pair of 1970s curtains. So I honestly cannot laugh at any fashion faux pas these days.
I love that. Listen, can we talk? You mentioned Avis. Can we talk about Avis? It is one of my all-time favorites, I think. So, for people who don't know of it, maybe you can kind of give the background.
So 1962, Avis had never made a profit. They're working with the ad agency DDB, and there's a brilliant copywriter called Paula Green, and she comes up with this wonderful line, we're number two, so we try harder. So essentially they're emphasizing they're not the market leader, but suggesting because they haven't got absolute popularity, there is a stronger incentive to be really service-oriented. Now, that would be an example of the pratfall effect. So this is the argument that if you admit a flaw, you become more appealing.
Yeah.
There are also studies that suggest if you admit a flaw, you become more believable. So the pratfall effect was by Elliot Aronson. He first researched it in 1966 and showed that, people that admitted a flaw tend to be more likable. And there are much later studies by Kipling Williams at the University of Toledo that show if a defense lawyer admits a flaw in their case, doesn't even try and rebut it, but they draw attention to a weakness, they are more likely to get their client off than if they let the prosecution do it. Now, one of the most interesting things about Avis is if you notice the dates I mentioned, Avis was 1962. Yeah. VW at DDB was 1959. Ugly as only skin deep. The academic experimentation was 1966. The creatives, the planners, the strategists, they had got there before the academic. And that's not post-rationalization. One of Birnbach's famous quotes is a small admission gains a large acceptance. So, he knew what he was doing. He was putting this pratfall effects to good purpose before the academics got anywhere near it.
Isn't that incredible? I mean, he's obviously, revered for all the right reasons, And as you're talking there, I'm kind of in my brain going, is anybody, I'm not saying everyone should replicate everything. I remember I talked about this in a role I had where we were the clear number two in a market. And I was just like, I just sent everyone the Avis ad. I was like, there has to be something in this. What's our version of this, in a market where the number one competitor was I think 80 to 90% consideration. It was just, they just owned the market. And so are there brands that are doing stuff similar to this now that you can think of? I'm struggling.
So I think through history, this has been a rare technique. Now, if you were to write down all the brands that have applied the pratfall effect, you could get I don't know, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, and there would be some of the greatest brands ever up there, like Guinness, good things come to those who wait.
Yeah.
Stella Artois, reassuringly expensive, emphasizing the priciness. But that's a little bit of survivorship bias. Like one study I did, I went back to the newspaper archives and went through old papers trying to count the number of ads that rhymed. But the main thing that struck me during that study was most ads are terrible. I mean, they were in the 70s, they are in the 80s, they're not. I mean, that's not a factor of advertising, it's a factor of all art. Yeah.
Creative.
There's something like Sturgeon's Law or something, I might have got the name wrong, who says, 90% of all content is crap. He was talking about science fiction writing. But that's what should be expected. So it wasn't that there was this golden age of the pratfall effect and now, we've lost our way. You could still point to examples like Marmite. Love it, hate it. You point to the fact that some people despise your product and there's kind of this weird trade-off in people's mind. They think, well, if some people despise it, does that mean that it must be a really extreme taste and therefore some people must love it? So there's definitely still people using it. But when I went through a weekend's worth of papers, so getting lots of different papers, counting all the ads, counting the number of pratfall effects, if I was being a strict adjudicator, probably 0 of the 400 ads use the pratfall effect. Even being very loose, the definition, it was 1 or 2. So it is a very distinctive strategy, and that alone is a reason to consider it. Because the von Restorff effect, one of the oldest studies in behavioural science, 1933 study by Hedwig von Restorff, shows we are hardwired to notice what's distinctive. So if every other competitor, every other ad in the newspaper is bragging, if you admit to flaw, you're going to be distinctive. And then you get over one of the biggest hurdles in communications, which is simply being noticed, simply being heard.
Yeah, because so many of us in our roles, and whatever brands we work on, we fall into category orthodoxies where, it's like, well, this is how we speak. Because actually what happens is, I think, is we will do the research, we'll talk to the consumers, we'll talk to the non-customers, we'll try to get the insights. But because there might be like 5 or 6 or 10 other brands in the category probably doing the same, we're probably all going to land on very similar insights, depending on the category. And so finding ways to actually, be different and distinctive is helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's 2 elements. There's one, if you ask a customer what they think a brand should communicate, well, how the hell do they know what to say? The easy way of answering that is think, well, what do people normally do? And I'll repeat back their approach. So you end up with these categories where the car ads are ridiculous. Lots of side shots of a car going around some kind of nondescript continental European mountain highway, or every perfume ad is absurdly surreal. So I think if you ask consumers, that's where you end up. But there's a second, like almost internal professional problem that exacerbates that, which is defensive decision making. Now, if you are a lager brand and you decide to put your £10 million on a football sponsorship, if it goes disastrously wrong, you can probably defend yourself internally and maintain your job by saying, well, look, the football sponsorship wasn't terrible. Carling do it, Heineken do it, Carlsberg do it. If you put that 10 million quid into, let's say, some kind of alternative universe, table tennis, where no one used but was an equally sensible place, if that failed, it would be much harder to defend your decision. People would turn around and say, well, obviously it was awful because Carlsberg, because Heineken, because Carling don't sponsor table tennis. So I think people are not just trying to think what is the most effective thing for the brand. They're thinking, how can I make sure that I still have a paycheck in 2 months' time? And that leads to mimicry, not distinctiveness.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, because it is like when you're in a role, these things are really hard, right? Because like, are they the hill you're going to almost die on? You know what I mean? Are you willing to take that fight? And so it's a really hard thing to do. And I guess probably it is looking to others that have done the unusual and saying, well, look, this has worked.
Yes. Although the problem with case study is you pick a brand and there'll be some brands that behave distinctively that collapsed, some that boomed. The problem with case study is there's never one factor that drives their success. So you can pick a case study to prove your point. That's why I think the behavioural science experiments are so useful. What they do is they test a single factor about communication. They hold every other variable the same. And then they say, in this situation, we saw an improvement in memorability through von Restorff effect or concreteness. So it's a really good way of isolating what is that variable, what will be the impact of that variable. And again, if you look at memory tests, and I've done quite a few, where you show people, say, 20 numbers. 20 numbers, 19 are in black, one's in blue. The proportion of people that remember the blue number will be 10 times that of the black number. Now, you can see that you can prove the value of distinctiveness when it comes to memorability with simple experiments like that. And because nothing else is varying in the test, you can attribute everything back to that driver.
You did at the Tam Ireland. You did one. I was so bad, and you called out words.
Yeah.
I was honestly, I was a complete disaster at that. Like, I think I got 2, and so many people got loads.
That's average. The people that read the lists out, the ones that do particularly well. So the thing you're talking about is I basically reran a 1972 study by Ian Begg. So he was this brilliant Canadian psychologist, worked at the University of Western Ontario, and for his study, he reads out 22-word phrases, and then he asks people later on what they can remember. And half of the phrases he reads out are what he calls abstract phrases. So these are intangible things that you cannot visualize, like a subtle fault or a basic fact. The other half of the words are what he calls concrete phrases. So these are physical items that you can picture. So a square door is a concrete phrase, or a rusty engine, or a flaming forest, something that you can picture in your mind's eye. And when Begg did his study, people remember on average 9% of the abstractions, but 36% of the concrete phrases. So you've got this massive difference in memorability. You're 4 times more likely to remember a word that you can visualize versus a word that you can't easily visualize. And his argument is it's because vision is the most powerful of our senses. So if you activate this kind of mental imagery, you are making your language very sticky. If you remain in the abstract, you're very forgettable. So a simple example of that would be in the energy drink category. Think about Red Bull. A lesser marketing team would have just said Red Bull gives you energy. But energy is abstract. You can't picture it. What they did instead is say Red Bull gives you wings. Now, I can straight away picture someone flying. I can imagine those wings flapping. That's a concrete image, and therefore it's much, much more memorable. So you're absolutely right. That is a huge impact on memorability, and it's something that is costless for any copywriter or brand to apply.
And it's interesting, as you were talking there, I thought about radio as well as a powerful medium for that as well. Because like I used to do stuff at radio, and we kind of talked about it like the theatre of the mind. We were doing a storytelling initiative with radio stations here in the UK, and we were saying like the ability for people to kind of paint their own picture with the power of words, and even the power of like dead air on radio, which DJs are always told never have dead air, and we were like, have dead air, because people have to fill that space with an emotion. You know, we were doing it was for Children's Hospital fundraising and those stories. But anyway, it was really interesting to see how that power of radio can.
But I think with radio, there's it could go one of two ways. Because there's no image in the same way there is in print or TV. You've probably got an extreme effect. So if you talk about quality, if you talk about trustworthiness, I saw a Lexus ad yesterday, which was something like, quite an old one, but what was it? Luxuriously crafted, consciously engineered. I mean, wow, that is just ridiculously abstract. Now, you say that on radio.
Chocolate as well.
No one's going to remember it. By the time the ad has finished, people have forgotten. But if you say Skittles, taste the rainbow, I can picture a rainbow. You say melts in your mouth, not your hands. I can picture my hand with sticky grub on it. It's on radio. If you use those concrete terms, absolutely you're going to have the theatre of the mind. But many brands don't get there because they stay in this realm of abstraction.
And is that because one of the things that comes across again in the in stuff you've written and books and talks you've given is rational, like the rational thinking, and the fact that maybe we kind of say there's an assumption that our customers are rational, but I think maybe us as marketers are we too rational ourselves? Is that a starting point?
Well, yes. And I think rational and emotional are kind of tricky terms, but we certainly, I think, rely too much on what customers directly tell us. And that's problematic, and we talk about that. And the second thing we do is we assume decisions are thought through and well considered, whereas most of the evidence suggests people will make an immediate snap decision. Do I like this product or dislike it? Am I warm or cold to this communicator? That intuitive response comes first, and then logics is used afterwards to justify those decisions to ourselves. So I think both mistakes create problems. So like that first one is the danger of claims data. If you sit someone down in a focus group or a survey, and send them questions and take their answers at face value, you have an implicit assumption. You are assuming that people know their own motivations, and they are willing to share those.
Yeah.
But the evidence suggests otherwise. So we talked about social proof earlier. It's a famous study by Robert Cialdini, 2008, where he works with a hotel and he persuades this hotel to let him change the messages that are running in guest rooms, encouraging them to reuse their towels.
Okay.
And I'll simplify this study just for quickness, but one half the rooms, the message says, please reuse your towels. It's good for the environment. And you get 35% of people reusing their towels. Other set of rooms, he says, this is the social proof message, the tailored social proof message. He changes the message in the room, gets rid of all the logic and the rationality, gets rid of the environmental message. Now he says, please reuse your towels. Most guests who've stayed in this room have done so. And there you see a 40% improvement.
Wow.
So you've got 49% of people reusing their towels. Now, that is a lovely study. Cialdini hasn't, let people know that he's watching them. He's worked with the cleaners. They've told him people to reuse the towels. So it's a really robust study. But what he then does is a more standard market research technique. He sends out a survey. And he says to people, look, imagine you're in a hotel and imagine you saw these messages, which would influence you? And people say, well, of course I wouldn't be influenced by the crowd. I don't care what other people have done in this room. That's irrelevant. I am influenced by the environment.
Yeah.
Now, what people claimed in that setting is the absolute opposite of what actually influenced them. And that is a broad theme of behavioural science. It might be in that situation because people are absolutely directly lying. They know that they wouldn't be influenced, but they feel like they should say that the environment's important. Or, which is more worrying and more troubling to get around, they simply just don't know their own motivations.
Yeah.
So there's this amazing psychologist called Timothy Wilson who says we are strangers to ourselves. And if, because you don't know your own motivations, if you use focus groups, if you send surveys, people are giving you plausible post-rationalizations of their behavior that sound sensible, but they don't bear any relationship to what actually influenced them. So I think you're right. That's a big thing that sends us off in the wrong direction as marketers.
Doesn't it? And then, so what do you, I guess, what do you do? Because, we do use surveys and we do use focus groups. And I guess you're not saying they don't have a place. Am I wrong?
You're right now. And it'd be crazy to get rid of them completely. But I'm still sending not a lot of focus group attendees, but I mean, the principle. I would certainly be doing it a lot less. I would secondly be putting a question mark on any response. Now, this is not unvarnished truth. It is it's a bit of information to be interpreted. And then the third thing I'd be doing would be taking inspiration from Cialdini. He found a very good solution. He didn't ask people directly what would influence them. Half the rooms had message A with environment message. Half the rooms had message B with the tailored social proof argument. And then he monitored how behavior changed. That is the gold standard of how a scientist, how a pharma company would test a drug. They don't send you a drug and tell you, do you like it? Was it quite good? Did it make you want to purchase more? They will randomize people into two cells. They'll try and keep a degree of uncertainty about who's in which cell, and then they'll monitor the results. I mean, that's how to get to the genuine truth about things.
Which brings us kind of to it doesn't bring it. It is slap bang in experimentation and testing and learning. And I think that's it's a great lever for marketers to have. But then a lot of them might say, well, we don't have those budgets to test and learn. I think there's two things. Sorry, because I want to get your opinion because they're connected. I think the budget and then the expertise or capabilities to do that, because I think you do need some structure around it as well. But I'd love to get your view on both of those.
So budget, it doesn't have to be expensive. If you have a website, if you have a chain of shops, you have a laboratory. You have a laboratory that most academic psychologists would cut off their right arm to have access to. If you're a big brand, people going to your website in their thousands, well, randomize them into two groups. One of them, you tell them 9 out of 10 people recommend our product. The other, you give them a logical, rational reason to buy. And well, then you see the difference in conversion. That would be a very valid test about the power of social proof for your particular market. Or even if you're sending out a survey, you can still use some of these principles. So one of the things I regularly do is use this idea of monadic testing. And it's a pompous word for a very simple thing, which is take the principles of an A/B digital test and you apply it to your survey. So you send out, let's say, 100, we probably do a lot more, let's say 1,000 surveys, and you randomize people into two groups. And one of them will see a description of a product with, say, 4 or 5 variables. The other half will see the same product, the same description with 4 or 5 variables, but one of the variables is changed. So what I mean by that, I think an actual example probably makes it clearer. I did a study with a colleague in 2016-ish, and we sent out 500 surveys. Half the people, well, actually it was a quarter, were shown a picture of a car, a description of the car, and then the annual price. A quarter was shown picture, description, and the monthly price, quarter, weekly price, quarter, daily price. Now, everyone was then asked how good value the car was. And each figure that a respondent saw, they only saw one figure, it would have annualized up to the same amount.
Right.
So let's say it's £1 a day, some people see for a year, or other people see £365 for a year. Because they're being told the same price, in effect, you would think logically they should all have the same opinions about the car. But that's not what happens. If people see the annual price, they think it's bloody awful value. So like 10 or 11% of people thought it was decent value. But if they see that daily equivalent price, it's up to, I think it was 45 or 50% of them think it was good value. Now, the point of running through that is because you take this oblique approach, there's a bit of subterfuge. People don't know what's being tested. They think they're weighing up the picture and description versus the price. They cannot possibly know that from the researcher's bird's eye view, we are changing the time unit. And because they don't know what they're doing, what they're being tested on, you get these much more accurate answers. But what most standard research would do is put two options side by side. They say, well, would you prefer £365 a year or £1 a day? And you can imagine the respondent, they'll roll their eyes and say, well, this is blinky ridiculous. These are the same things. What do you take me for? But if you do the monadic test, you see completely different results. Now, that doesn't cost you anything extra as a brand. Any research agency can do a monadic test, but it gets you much closer to the truth.
It's really interesting, and price is such a fascinating
absolutely
space, isn't it? Also, even price, but discounts, and so things like percentages off. Like, I've often had a view, and people struggle with understanding what the percentage off is.
Yeah,
right or wrong.
Yeah, well, and I've been very careful about
100% off was good.
Yeah, you're certainly, I think, right about people struggling with maths. It's not that they couldn't get a paper out
exactly.
and do it, but if you're making a snap decision, So there is a one-off study that's quite interesting. I'd always be a bit loath about putting too much emphasis on a single study because it might just be a statistical fluke. And it's a study by Gonzalez, I think it's EGADE Business School in Mexico. And she shows people, or half the group of people, I think it's let's say, I don't know, pack of balloons or something for 48 pesos. And some of them are told there's a 12 peso discount, was 48 pesos now, 12 pesos off. Other people are told was 48 pesos, 25% off. And what she finds in that individual study is the percentage discount is more effective. But
really,
that's just half the people. The other half are told about a suit, which is 480 pesos. Now they are told either it's 25% off or 120 pesos off. And this time it's the 120 peso people who think it's better value. So Jonah Berger he gives it this lovely name, the rule of 100. Essentially, once you cross this threshold of 100, if you get much higher, almost by definition, the absolute amount is larger than the percentage in naive terms. The actual, just think about the number, what it represents.
Yeah.
Under 100, the other way around. So her argument, his argument is, if you've got this product that's over 100, talk about absolute discount. Under 100, talk about percentages off. Now, that is a one-off study. So I would very much, if I was a retailer, be treating that as a semi-proven hypothesis. But the great thing is you can put that into your testing plan.
Yeah.
And a big retailer, they'll know by tomorrow whether it works or not.
Yeah, but exactly. And I'm thinking any category, you can use your email database, whatever it is, and kind of go, right, we're actually going out with, renewals now, and let's go, we've 10% off, but let's do the value in this one, 10% off in this one. Maybe you do a third, which is nothing in it, and then see, which has the higher uplift.
Absolutely. And the great thing is, you might as well have as your starting place, not a blank sheet of paper and think, well, what are the 10 tests we could do? Why not draw on hundreds of psychologists' work into what generally works in terms of making a price appear palatable? So you could test things like present bias. You talked about renewals. Send them out 6 weeks earlier. The argument being price rises are painful if they're about to hit us. 6 weeks' time, it's someone else's problem. So bring forward the emails, you might see an improvement. The other argument with this power of because, give people a reason about why they've got a discount. If you just say it's 10% off, I'm assuming, well, it's not a real discount. But if you say, for example, I'm really sorry, we've looked at your year that you had our phone and we saw there was a bit of a problem in June, we're therefore giving you a 10% discount. Suddenly I'm thinking, I've got a special thing exclusive to me because of the problems I've had in the past. That will be more effective. Now, there's so many things you can do that just don't cost you any money. So there's wonderful opportunities in the world of pricing.
And the other side of pricing as well is discount versus maybe, I don't know, reward being the right word, or just added value, because obviously the less you have to discount, better for your business, right? Because you've got your price premiums not affected. Is there anything that kind of shows that adding reward or added value, for example, do this now and you'll be entered in, you could win this thing, or we'll give you this additional value?
So there's a couple of things there. There's firstly, which of those broad routes you go down, reducing price, discounting, or giving added value. And then second, whichever you choose, how to make them as powerful as possible. So there is a study from Baba Shiv, who's at Stanford, which should set off alarm bells for anyone who is repeatedly discounting. And his is the argument that what we experience is what we expect to experience. So he did his test in wine, which is probably a little bit extreme, but he served some Americans 5 different bottles of wine, each with a prominent price label. But crucially, they are different bottles of wine. They're not different wines.
Okay.
So 2 of the bottles have exactly the same wine in, but very different price labels. So you start off in this experiment, you are sipping a little bit of this Merlot you think comes from a $5 bottle. And then 2 or 3 wines later, you will sip exactly the same wine, but you think it's coming from a $45 bottle. And what Shiv shows is it's completely different responses. If you drink from the cheap bottle, you think the product's crap. If you drink from the expensive bottle, you think it's amazing. Now, when he quantifies this, there is a 70% variance in ratings. So his argument, we assume generally, because it's true, normally, it's a reasonable rule of thumb, we assume if something's expensive, it's going to be high quality. If it's cheap, it's going to be low quality. And that takes on a life of its own. We start looking for evidence to confirm our existing beliefs. So if we think it's super cheap, we might interpret those tannins as a negative thing, or, the kind of rough feeling as it being awful. But if we, get it from the expensive bottle, surely this, rough taste is just a sign of its body and its potency or whatever. So if you repeatedly discount, you are training people to think your product is poor quality. And it's not just they'll think that, it will actually affect their experience. So that, to me, is a strong argument about avoiding repeated discounts. Maybe your route of the more added value approach is a better one.
Yeah, you can almost see the people with getting the glass and twirling it.
And that's one that people can, a nice little experiment or game people can play on their friends and family when they come round for dinner. Get the cheapest bottle you can and put it in some kind of fancy shatter and vice versa.
We did it, not like a slight variation of that for our wedding, going way back. But we were like, let's taste the wine. It was fun. But we covered all the bottles because, again, we didn't want the bias to be there. Kind of, I love that one, and have people taste and score and rate. And I think the problem, obviously, it came the later it got. The lack of accuracy and everything became, flawed experiment. But it was fun.
I'm slightly nervous about doing this test. I'm a bit of a coffee snob, and I always thought I really liked fancy coffee. And then I've got this horrible feeling that I actually just can't tell the difference between, Pret to a barista to Nescafe. So I feel like I'm maintaining this myth, whereas actually I know in my heart of hearts You give me a cup of instant coffee and I'll be perfectly happy if I thought it came out of a civets gut or whatever. Yeah.
It's brilliant. But it makes me think about brands that have had that perception of, I'll use the word cheap, which is probably unfair, but, lower quality because they're lower cost. And there's lots of categories that, we see it in retail is probably a great one. And yet some brands have managed to make that shift to still remaining low cost comparatively, but have managed to increase perceptions of quality.
Yeah. So Lidl and
Any
Aldi,
thoughts on how?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Lidl and Aldi first came to Britain, it wasn't that long ago. I can remember when they appeared. People were very snooty about them because they were so
snooty is the
cheap.
right word. Yeah,
exactly. Compared to Tesco or Sainsbury's. So they did a few clever things. I mean, one of the most effective ads they have was they would set up there was a TV ad where they set up a fancy farmer's market. People are trying the products and they think, oh, this is amazing. They're being told it's kind of artisan, yogurt or whatever. And then at the end, it's revealed it's Lidl or Aldi. So what they're trying to do there is get people to try it and taste it before they know the brand, because then you're removing that kind of negative framing. So that was they repeatedly did that in the ads. But I think the other thing that made their brands was social proof. Something that 1% of people were doing might have been looked at snobbily by other people. Yeah. Once it gets that groundswell of 40 or 50% of people doing it, suddenly it's much more acceptable because we're influenced by what others do. And then I think the final part, we haven't talked about this experiment. It's an amazing experiment. It's about the language you use to frame a behaviour. So there's a classic study, a 1974 study from Loftus and Palmer, which has very scary social implications, but I think it's also interesting as a brand. So what they did, I think they were at the University of Washington at the time, they show people these video clips of two cars, some kind of test cars, crashing into each other. So it's a black car and a white car. And they say to the first group of people, how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other? And the average answer is about 30 miles an hour. Next group, how fast were the cars going when they bumped together, collided together, crashed together. Final group, how fast were the cars going when they smashed together? Now that final group, estimate the average speed at 40 miles an hour. So this about. So it was a 27% swing in estimates. Now remember, everyone is seeing exactly the same video. The car's going exactly the same speed. All that's changing is the verb that's used to describe the cars.
Wow.
And what they argued was the language we use affects what we see. We don't see events neutrally. We interpret them through a lens of the language that's used. So if you say something's smashed, you assume it's fast. If you say something's collided, you assume it's slow. Now, they did the original studies because they wanted to draw attention to the danger of eyewitness testimony that I'm not sure if malevolence is the right word, but a skilled police officer who is trying to twist someone's memories could do that. But I think for marketers, it's around, you've got to make sure that the same event is being interpreted through the most positive from your perspective, positive language. So if Lidl and Aldi are seen as acts of desperation, you are shopping there because you need to, that is not going to, I'm not saying this is a nice thing, but it's not going to draw in more affluent people. But if it's framed as being savvy shopping, why would you buy the same good at Waitrose and buy 3 times as much? You're a mug. You're not impressing me with your affluence. You're a mug. So it's exactly the same situation, but that language of desperation versus savviness will have a completely different effect. So I think, I think that language framing, and they certainly had bags and things that talk about savvy shopping. I think that's another one that permeated through culture.
I mean, they're a fantastic example, I think, of just being able to shift those perceptions of, being seen there while, was, and then it was like, I think products then, people started going there for, well, I'll get my basics there, but I won't get my meat there. There. And I was like, but have you tried the steak? Oh, yeah, but I won't get my wine there. Oh, have you tried their version of Whispering Angel? It's delicious. And then all of a sudden, it kind of became a bit of the secret. Like, do you know that thing that they have that nobody, and it's amazing. They've done a phenomenal job.
I live in South London, and the fanciest neighbourhood nearby, something called Dulwich Village. And there was this little corner shop that used to sell these weird brands, but it's in such an affluent area and it's all fancy and things. You just assume they were super premium brands.
Yeah.
And then a mate who was German was like, no, this is all bargain basement stuff. And they were using this other way around. They had this frame of, luxury, and you assumed it was all amazing stuff. They were actually just pulling the wool over people's eyes, which I always thought was both horrifying and kind of slightly amusing at the same time. Yeah.
That is brilliant, though. There's a brilliant example. I don't know if you've seen this one. Do you know Doug Cameron, who was the co-author of Cultural Strategy?
Oh, no, I don't know.
Yeah. So Doug did a brilliant campaign in the States for pay less shoes. And he, the kind of bargain base.
Yes. Yeah, I think I have seen this. Yeah. They made this they pretended there was some fancy Italian.
Yeah, exactly. They put in a really exclusive shop and brought influencers in. And what was lovely is that the tone of it was right. They weren't taking the piss out of anybody. They weren't trying to make people look bad. But they were like, when you change the context of how something appears and shows up, it completely changed your perception of it.
Absolutely. And you see that, we've talked about some quite extreme examples, but it's something that isn't just for low price brands. The other one that I did, and I did this with not a representative audience, so take it with a pinch of salt, but I've done other studies that show the same points. I think it's a valid one to discuss. So I recruited a group of colleagues, and I made up this story about we were pitching for a brand, and I served them bottles of wine and then also King Cobra lager. So King Cobra lager is this very strong lager that comes in big wine bottles. It's got like a cork. And I just asked them to rate how much they like the taste and how much they'd be prepared to pay for each of the bottles. Got rid of all the data except for willingness to pay for King Cobra. And I can't remember the data. So let's say they said it was $4.75. It was something like that. I got another group of people in, served them 12 bottles of lager and King Cobra. And this time, when I got the willingness to pay for King Cobra, it was something like £3.50.
Right.
And what's happening here is the reference set acts as an anchor. So if King Cobra is surrounded by wine, back 10 years ago, whenever it was, maybe people thought, okay, £5, fair price for a bottle of wine. This King Cobra stuff is beer, so it's worth less, and it's not strong, so it's worth less. So it's not worth £5, maybe £4.85, maybe £4.75. People adjust, but crucially, they don't adjust very far. The second setting, when people were drinking it surrounded by like beers, they might have thought, well, £2.50 is a fair price for a bottle of lager in a supermarket. This King Cobra stuff's bigger, it's stronger. Well, maybe it's £3, maybe it's £3.75. So it's not that the reference set completely changes behavior, but what it does is set the starting place for valuation. And people, yes, they adjust, but they don't adjust far enough. So you change that reference set for your product. Now, this is something that you can apply and have phenomenal effects on willingness to pay.
That's really interesting because, again, we talk about strong brands being able to leverage price premiums, and then you can kind of talk to, the idea of how brands, like the neighborhood of brands, for example, like if you can show up in the same category as like, I don't know, like BMW, there's a way for you to kind of be in that kind of.
The classic example, and this is one Rory Southern's talks about brilliantly. I think it's in his book Alchemy, which is a wonderful book. So he talks about Nespresso. And if you think about an alternative universe where, let's say, a lesser team than Nestle launched this product, maybe they stuffed their coffee granules into kilo bags and sold them on the shelves of Tesco's. Well, do you know what a kilo of Nespresso would now cost? It'd be about, 70, 80 quid. Now, I would argue there's no one in Britain of sound mind who would go to Tesco's, push aside a 15 quid bag of Dow egg books and take home an £80 bag of espresso. It'd feel ridiculous. Yeah. But you put that coffee stuff into pods. Crucially, a pod gives you a cup-sized serving. Once people think of the comparison set for pods of coffee, for cups of coffee, suddenly it's Starbucks. And because Starbucks charge £4 for a flat white, the 80 pence that Nespresso want for a pod of Lungo coffee looks amazingly good value. 80 pence for the pod, £80 for the bag. It's the same per gram price. But because you have subtly shifted the mental comparison set, you have radically changed people's willingness to pay. So every brand, I think, could apply this principle. It's just how you apply the kind of principles of price relativity and anchoring and framing that changes from situation to situation.
Absolutely. And I did want to ask you, and we're going to run out of time, but I did want to ask you a couple more questions. One was like in the space of kind of what I call like grudge purchases, right? And I, like in the space of insurance, where people don't want to make the purchase, and they have to make it infrequently, and there's no joy. Right? Yeah. Have you seen any experiments that have kind of helped brands in that kind of space?
Yeah. So infrequency is a really interesting part of that area. There was an English economist called Ken Binmore, and when behavioural economics, which I would say is a subset of behavioural science, when that came to the fore, the work of Kahneman, Tversky, Thaler, he famously said, okay, this stuff, these quirks of human nature, they might be relevant when people are buying cans of Coke or bags of crisps, but when you are buying annual insurance or a car or a house, they're not going to work because people have a vested interest to think things through strongly. But then the Nobel Prize winner, Richard Thaler, said, look, Ken, you've got this completely the wrong way around. If you are buying bags of crisps, well, you learn your preference. You do it so regularly, you know what you like, you know what you don't like. If you're going annually to buy a phone contract or annually to buy travel insurance, you know that you don't know. It's such an infrequent purchase that you are more influenced by these biases because you can't possibly weigh these products on a logical basis. You will default to, I've got 3 products in front of me, I'll pick the middle one, extremeness virtue. Right. I've got loads of products in front of me, I'll pick the one that spends extravagantly on TV, costly signaling. I'll pick the one that I know loads of other people have, social proof. The more infrequent a purchase, I think the more powerful these biases become. And that actually became known as the Binmore continuum. That maybe when they're very small purchases, people use biases because they can't, it's not worth thinking about things. Large purchases, infrequent purchases, it's because they have no detailed knowledge base or known preference. They then revert to the biases as well.
I'll be digging into that one.
Yeah.
You across the 2 books, there's 41 and a half biases. Am I right?
Yes.
And I love the half.
Yeah, that's the precision chapter in The Illusion of Choice. Yeah. Very short Brilliant. Chapter on the power of precision. Yeah.
I just thought you struggled. No.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, by the time you get to the end of the book, you're bloody ready for it to finish. So maybe there was a bit of that. Who knows?
Out of them, I don't mean like pick your favorite, but have any surprised you in the practical applications?
Yes. So the one I think I was most surprised was some of the fairness studies.
Okay.
So there's a 1996 study by Sally Blount and Max Baseman. And this one, the first one was run on students, but there's other stuff that proves it works elsewhere. So people arrive on campus and she goes up to them and says, will you come to my lab tomorrow and do half an hour of maths puzzles? I'll pay you $7. So remember, the $7 is the key bit. And about 72% of people say yes. Then she gets a fresh group of students passing by and picks them off one by one. She says, you can come to my lab tomorrow, do half an hour of maths puzzles. I'll pay you $8. But just for openness, I'm really sorry I was paying people $10 early, but I've run out of cash. Now, from a narrow-minded logical point of view, what we've got here is some people were offered $7, other people are being offered $8. You would expect that more people would take that offer, but it's exact opposite that happens. You get 54% of people accepting the $8. Now, she argues this is because an awful lot of behaviour is driven by a sense of fairness. We're not just weighing up the economic benefits of half an hour's work. We're also very attuned to what others have been given. And we are prepared to cut our nose off to spite our face if we think we're being treated unfairly. And that's one that I've always thought is a interesting watch out for brands.
Yeah.
So, explaining why price has gone up, give people reasons. Don't just say we're going up 10%, say, well, our costs have gone up, so and so. But I think there's also a much bigger opportunity, which is if you can reframe your competition as behaving unfairly, then I think that could galvanize people, especially in inert categories, to push through a high degree of effort to punish those incumbent brands.
Interesting. That's a very interesting one. Listen, Richard, we had time. And thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'd say I've seen you, read the books, I've seen you speak. It's always fascinating. And what fascinates me most is, and for anyone who doesn't watch and listens, Richard does not have a prompter in front of him with all these studies. It's that encyclopedic knowledge is just phenomenal to, reference things, but have that, and you're constantly obviously just researching, reading more, and trying to figure out more of these biases and how they apply for brands.
Yeah, but well, that's basically what I do day in, day out. Read about it, run my own experiments, work with clients. So that's very kind of you to say, Con. I appreciate it.
Amazing. Well, listen, thanks so much, and really appreciate it. Chat soon.
Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode with Richard. Fascinating as always. And actually, as we finished up, Richard mentioned to me that he's actually writing a new book, and it's going to be out in September, October time, but it's actually available for pre-order. It's called Hacking the Human Mind. And I actually have a link for the pre-order in the show notes, so you can go check that out. And also, of course, don't forget to check out his books if you haven't read them already. His previous books that are, of course, Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice. So look, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I was just fascinated. And I really feel actually in this episode, we got to some really practical examples and use cases for behavioral science. As Richard said, like a lot of evidence is there for us to help nudge human behavior, and it's in some ways agnostic to all the other things that are going on in the world around us in terms of, technology and media and everything that's going on. So it's definitely a huge piece of armory. And do you know what? The thing about Richard's books is they are so enjoyable to read. So aside from anything else, you'll just thoroughly enjoy them. So thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode and you think somebody else might enjoy it, please do share it with them. And if you would leave us a review or rate the podcast wherever you are tuned in, it would be really, really appreciated. They're a great way for us to reach an even larger engaged community of marketers just like you. So please, if you could do that one thing for us, rate, review, subscribe, it would really be appreciated. Listen, that is it for me until the next episode. Again, thanks so much for tuning in. For me, your host, Conor Byrne, take care.
If you would like to reach an engaged community of marketing leaders, get in touch with That's What I Call Marketing to discuss sponsorship opportunities.